All right, let's dive in. Today we're going to piece together the story of how a brand new era in European history, the Middle Ages, was basically born from the ashes of an old one.
You know, when you hear Middle Ages, what pops into your head? Probably knights, right? Castles, maybe even Robin Hood. But have you ever stopped to think, how did that world even begin? I mean, something huge had to fall apart for this thousand-year period to get started. Well, that's exactly what we're going to uncover.
Okay, first things first, a really key point here. The people actually living back then, they had no idea they were in the Middle Ages. For them, it was just, well, life. That name is something historians came up with way later. It's just a label for that huge chunk of time squished between the ancient world and what we think of as modern times.
So, where does a story like this even start? It all kicks off with the slow, dramatic end of one of the most powerful forces the world had ever known, the Roman Empire.
The problem really was pretty simple. Rome had become a victim of its own success. I mean, the empire was just so massive. We're talking stretching across continents. It got to the point where it was basically impossible for one single emperor to run the whole show. Something had to give.
So, what was the solution? They split it right down the middle. And boy, did those two halves go down different paths. The eastern half, run from Constantinople, did great. It thrived for centuries as what we now call the Byzantine Empire. But the western half, with its old capital in Rome, that's a different story. It was left weak, vulnerable, and totally exposed. And it's the collapse of that empire in the west that really kicks off everything we're talking about today.
So, with the Western Roman Empire basically falling apart, it couldn't defend its own borders anymore. And that created this huge power vacuum. Think about it. For all the groups of people living just on the edge of the empire, this was the moment they've been waiting for.
All these different tribes, Franks, Visigoths, Vandals, you name it, they started pouring in. They began grabbing up Roman land, carving out their own brand new kingdoms, and in the process, they totally redrew the map of Europe.
Now, the Romans had a word for all these outsiders, barbarians. But wait, it didn't mean what you think it means. It wasn't about being uncivilized. The word actually comes from the Latin barbarus, and it just meant foreigner. So to a Roman, if you weren't Roman, if you didn't speak Latin, you were a barbarian. Simple as that. It was all about culture.
And here's a cool little tidbit. Some of these tribes left a mark we can still see in our language. Take the Vandals. They got such a bad rap for looting and destruction when they sacked Rome that their name, well, it gave us our modern word vandalism. Crazy, right?
But maybe the biggest push came from way out east. A guy you've probably heard of, Attila the Hun. He led this incredible force of nomadic warriors out of Central Asia, and they just steamrolled everything in their path. This created a massive domino effect. It shoved other tribes, like the Goths, deeper and faster into Roman lands, which just sped up the whole collapse of the Western Empire.
So, Rome's political structure is crumbling. There's this giant hole where a government used to be. But into that chaos steps one, and only one, institution that didn't just survive, it actually thrived.
Think about it. In a world full of invasions and uncertainty, people were desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. And the Christian church, based right there in Rome, became that anchor. It gave people stability, a community, and a sense of hope when everything else was falling apart.
And you can see how it all played out, step by step. The empire falls, so people turn to the church. Then, the church gets busy converting all these new Germanic kings and their tribes, and what happens next? Well, over time, the church becomes incredibly rich and powerful. So powerful, in fact, that it was often stronger than many of the kings. This new team-up between the kings and the church, it's going to define the whole era. And there's one person who embodies this perfectly. A legendary leader from the tribe of the Franks who had this massive ambition to put the old empire back together, but this time in a new Christian way.
His name was Charles, but history remembers him as Charlemagne, which just means Charles the Great. For more than 45 years, he was constantly expanding his kingdom. He was such a powerful defender of Christianity that, and this is a huge moment, on Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope crowned him the new Roman Emperor. This was it. This was the moment that officially blended Germanic military power, the idea of Rome, and the power of the Church all into one.
And Charlemagne's legacy was just massive. He was a huge champion for Christianity. He kicked off a mini renaissance of education and art. But how do you run such a giant empire? Well, he relied on a system that would become the blueprint for the Middle Ages. He gave land to his nobles, and in return they had to provide him with soldiers. This whole system, we call it feudalism.
Okay, so that's the big picture, right? An empire falls, new kingdoms pop up, the church is in charge. But what was it like for the average person? What was daily life actually like in this new world?
I mean, it was a totally different world. Just try to imagine this, a life with no clocks. Time was just the sun and the seasons, and travel, it was so hard and dangerous that most people never went more than a few miles from where they were born. And because of that isolation, you had hundreds of different local dialects. You might not even be able to understand the person from the very next village.
And society was all built on that system Charlemagne made famous, feudalism. It was basically a pyramid of promises. At the very top, you have the king. He owns all the land, but he can't manage it all. So he gives big chunks of it to his nobles and church leaders. What do they give back? Loyalty and, more importantly, knights for his army. And at the bottom of it all, you have the serfs. They weren't exactly slaves, but they were tied to the land, working it for everyone above them. And what did they get in return? Protection. In a very dangerous world, that was a pretty big deal.
But life was also incredibly hard. And nothing was worse than the plague. The Black Death just tore through Europe. In the 1300s alone, it's estimated to have killed 1/3 of the population. A third. It's a number that's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. A total catastrophe.
So, there you have it. Out of the ashes of Rome, a whole new world was born. A world built not on being a citizen of an empire, but on personal loyalty. A world defined not by a government, but by the church. It was an age of total chaos and deep faith, of incredible hardship, but also amazing ambition. And you know, even though the knights and castles are gone, it really makes you wonder, how much of that DNA, that focus on loyalty, land, and faith, is still shaping our world today?